So this one's going to cover a few bits we spoke about last time. It's going to be more theory based to give you some ideas around how to potentially edit your photo with a bit around lighting so you can take a good photo to start with, which will help you with your editing afterwards. So we'll jump right in. So lighting is, I think I mentioned before, probably the most important part of taking a photo, even more important than your subject, really. Depending on the light you have, the position you have it, you can quite drastically change what your subject looks like. So I've got this picture here, which I find quite useful for showing its effect. So it's sort of a bit of a grid. So if the light's above, below, or at eye level with whatever subject you might be using, in this case, obviously a person, to the left at varying degrees and straight on, and then to the right. You can see it sort of massively changes how a face can look. It can flatten cheekbones. It can make them look a lot wider. It can make your sort of chin look a bit sharper or rounder, depending on where your lighting is. And so if you think that can happen to a person, it's obviously going to happen to a flower. It's going to happen to whatever you take a photo on. So you really want to try and position the light in a sort of flattering way for whatever you're going to be taking your photo of. So if you're inside, you can use a lamp to do this. You can obviously move it around or move your subject around in front of the lamp in varying ways. I recommend doing that just to have a play, just to end up seeing how different shadows moving across it can impact the sort of depth of it versus how flat it can look. If you look at this one, the face can look quite flat, whereas if you look here, you can start to see a lot more definition in the face. The same will happen with whatever you're going to take a photo of. So I recommend getting a lamp, potentially after, whenever you fancy doing it. Get something you want to take a photo of. It can be a teddy, it can be a flower, it can be whatever, and just move it around while you're aiming your camera at it and see what happens, just to get a feel for how light position can impact your composition. Pardon me. Moving on. So there's two different kinds of sort of lighting when it comes to taking a photograph. Diffused, which is where the light is going through something, which is softening it. You can see in this picture again, down here, non-diffused versus diffused lighting. If you're just taking your lamp, you don't have a light shade on, you don't have anything, it's just the bulb, and you're blasting it at your subject, in this case, a person, the shadows are going to be incredibly dark. They're going to be very sharp. So the lines are going to be straight. They're going to be barely any curve to them. It's going to be a clinical photograph, I think is what a lot of people will say. It's going to be quite dramatic, which might be what you're aiming for. But if you're looking for a bit of a softer, more light, pleasant look, you're going to want to try and put something in front of the light. So you might already have something on it. So I know IKEA do lots of sort of lampshades that cover the whole sort of surround like a little globe. That is a good way of diffusing the light. Or you can just hold something like parchment paper in front of it. You can get a pillowcase. So as long as you've got a sort of white pillowcase, if you just hang that on something in front of your light, so your lamp or your, just clip it to your sort of open light shade, it will diffuse the light, or just even a white t-shirt. So anything you can sort of put in front of your light source to diffuse through it, you'll get a nice softer tone, not just to your shadows, but overall like the actual light part of the image as well. So the highlights will look a bit softer as well, look a bit warmer. Pardon me. Onwards. So the next obviously is natural versus artificial. So artificial is going to give you, again, quite harsh, clinical, dramatic, hard lighting. But natural lighting tends to be the way you want to go if you can. And like with the position of lamps, it's going to dramatically change not just the harshness of like the face or the flower or whatever, but the sort of white balance of it as well. There's a couple of times in the day which are best for taking photos. So the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset are called the golden hour. You can take photos outside of those times, obviously, but if you want to take the best photo, that's the sort of time you want to be in. That's because everything will have a bit of a golden sheen over it. It's going to be nice and soft. And if there's some clouds, like in this photo I've taken, it will sort of soften the light even further. and make all your shadows feel a bit less harsh, your highlights feel a bit more warm, and everything will just feel a bit more pleasant. So I recommend, if you can, getting up early for the hour after sunrise, or going out just for an evening walk before sunset to get a really nice, soft, warm image. If you go out the hour before sunrise, sorry, and the hour after sunset, you're going to be in something called blue hour. That's almost the opposite of golden hour. It's going to be quite soft light still, but it's going to be more blue, hence blue hour. It's going to make your photo feel a bit cold. It's going to make everything feel a bit sad is probably the word. But if you're trying to represent that in your image, that's probably the best time to go. If you're unable to get out at those times, try to avoid sort of bang in the middle of the day when the sun's directly above you. That's going to make your shadows really harsh underneath your subject, and it's going to sort of blow out, especially when using a phone, the actual surface of your photo. So try to get out in the morning or after midday if you can't get out in golden hour. So next, we're going to look at some different kinds of editing. These are two of many different ways you can edit your photo. That's high key and low key editing. So with low key, you're going to be making quite moody, quite dramatic, quite noir almost images. You're going to be bringing down your shadows. You're going to be bringing down your height. You're going to be bringing down everything really to try and get that sort of dark look. With high key, it's the opposite. You're pushing everything. You're making your shadows lighter. You're making your highlights extremely bright to almost build this ethereal image. So we'll go in a bit further detail for each of those. So I mentioned this in my last talk. This was a photo I took just before sunset. So the sun's sort of coming down at the moment, but the sky was incredibly bland. There was nothing there. And so I've pushed this photo into a high key editing style. I've blown the highlights, so you can't even really see what's going on in the sky because I don't really care what's going on there. I'm trying to bring your eyes towards the horses and just this nice sort of sparkle that's going on across the heather and the grass. And so I've brightened the shadows, I've brightened the highlights, I've brightened the exposure, and that should hopefully bring your eyes towards these horses and make it feel a bit airy, a bit light, a bit ethereal. As this says, it's used in fashion and portrait photography a lot. So if you're trying to take a photo of a person, you might lean towards a high key editing style so that you don't have those harsh shadows on someone's face, because softer shadows tend to look a bit more flattering and people will probably appreciate your photo of them more if you push it into a high key style. Conversely, low key editing, again, I've taken a photo here where I've dropped everything. I've brought the shadows down, I've brought the highlights down, I've brought the exposure down. I've tried to make it quite moody. So this is a sunset and it's just capturing a fishing boat that's sat perfectly in line with the sun, which was quite lucky. I don't really care about seeing much of the sea that's not in the light. I don't really care about seeing much of the clouds that aren't in the light. I wanted it to be a bit of a moody, dramatic fishing scene. So I've pushed it into this low-key style. When we get to the live demo section afterwards, I'll probably show a bit of this, both low-key and high-key, and how to achieve them. I'll be using Apple Photos based on sort of what most people are using, but it should work the same in Google Photos too. But moving on. Composition. We mentioned this before, it was mentioned before with the grid being turned on to help you with the rule of thirds. It's incredibly important to compose your photos well. If you don't compose your photos well, even editing isn't really going to save it. It's not going to be that engaging. It's not going to be that appealing. It's just going to be a bit of a snap, really. So you really want to take your time when taking a photo to try and use some of these concepts here. So we've got leading lines. So with this photo, as you can see, a windmill's been placed in the middle, and all of the lines for the fields of tulips lead towards the subject. So the thing that the photographer wants you to look at. We've also got viewpoints as a way of composing something. So in this case, a glass has been used to invert the image. You could use a piece of cellophane to sort of warp and twist the image, just do something interesting. So obviously, I'd say millions or billions of photographs have been taken of the Eiffel Tower. This person's tried to make it a bit different by using a glass and inverting and drawing your image into this part of the photo instead. As we spoke about before, rule of thirds, incredibly important. If you want people to look at a certain area, you're going to want to place your subject along one of these lines. And if you really want them to look at it, you're going to put it where the line intersects, because these are the sort of positions in a photograph or a painting or anything where your eyes are naturally going to be drawn towards. Next, we have balance. So you're going to want to balance your photo, really. You can see, or maybe not, these are quite small photos. In this top right one, the building and the dining out sign are positioned to the middle and right of the photo. That's left this big gap here on the left. So it feels a bit heavily weighted to the right-hand side. It's a bit unbalanced. The same for this little one here. Conversely, it's been placed on the left. There's a big gap to the right here, and it just feels a bit off because of it. Whereas this is a more balanced version of the photo. They've placed the building on the left, they've placed the sign on the right, they've left a bit of a gap in the middle to balance it between them, and it just makes it more visually appealing to look at because it doesn't feel like you're sort of leaning one way or the other. Finally, we've got symmetry. This also covers patterns. Humans really like symmetry. We really like patterns. We've sort of been primed evolutionary-wise to look for these things. So if you can capture them in your photo, it's naturally going to make people feel good when looking at the photo. So in this, it's balanced on either side. We've got symmetry between the windows. We've got nice parallel lines going down. It may not be the most interesting subject, but because of the symmetry and the patterns within it, we like looking at it. So if you can do that with your photo, great. And this one can be a controversial one, so I've left it for last here. Negative space. It's sort of the opposite to balance. It's almost an anti-pattern to balance. It's positioning your subject in such a way that you leave an awful lot of space around it. So your eyes are drawn to your subject because there's nothing else to look at, really. Sort of similar to the way I did some hike editing on those horses. I tried to completely remove the sky because I want to draw your eye towards it. This is taking it to the extreme and putting your subject in a small part of your photo where there's nothing else going on. Moving on to rule of thirds. So we're going to go a bit more in detail just on a few of these. So this is a sort of fundamental guideline in photography. It's not just photography, it's painting, it's all sorts of art. If you've seen videos or cinema or anything, the rule of thirds is being used almost all the time. If you can start to imagine this rule of thirds, you'll start to see it in everything you look at. People will try and place what they want you to look at, like I mentioned, on these intersections and along the horizontal and vertical lines. In this one, I've placed the flower here so that it intersects just to the right of the center. So it draws your eye in, and then you start to see the spiral pattern coming out from that. I've also tried to place this part of the flower in this sort of section here. I like to consider them sort of separate canvases almost within the picture. And I try to balance what's going on in each of them. So in this top right one, I filled about a third in the bottom. So in the top left one, I'm trying to not overfill it so that I'm balancing either side of the photo here. And if you zoom out a little bit, you can see this leaf down here sort of goes towards this horizontal line. So it's all sort of touching on and sitting within these rule of third lines. Next, we've got leading lines, as I mentioned. So this is one of my photographs as well. You want to use anything. So you can utilize natural or man-made lines. So you can use roads, fences, rivers, whatever lines exist within your picture. Try to view it less as an overall composition and see it as just geometric shapes almost. Try and line up the thing you're doing and take geometric lines through it. So in this case, I'm trying to bring your eyes towards this bridge, but also through and out into the forest. So I've lined up the bridge, which would be, if you were to imagine the rule of thirds line, somewhat on the bottom horizontal line. I've taken up the bottom canvas. So as I mentioned, I separate them into those little canvases based on the rule of thirds. I've placed the beginning of the road there, and I've brought it into the middle and through my subject. So when you look at this image, your eyes will probably start around here. They'll be yanked down here to the path that I want you to look at, up and through the bridge into the forest. It sort of gives you a bit of a story tell because it follows the path I want, I'm going to be walking along, or anyone's going to be walking along. And so I want your eyes to do the same almost. Symmetry and patterns was mentioned. So as I mentioned, we are evolutionary primed for this. We enjoy it, we like it. Even if your subject's not as interesting, as long as you've nailed the lighting and there's some patterns going on and some symmetry, it's going to be a pleasant image to look at. So this is a photo I've taken in Greece. It's a bunch of pillars, but there's some interesting shadows. There's nice lines going through, nice pattern here. We've got some nice patterns of the pillars going through. It might not be the most interesting, but it's nice to look at because of those patterns, textures, and shapes put together to form an overall just a nice thing to look at almost. Finally, we've got foreground, middle ground, and background. So when it comes to things like landscape photos, anyone can take a picture of these mountains in the background here. So this was on a recent walk in Wales. I imagine many people have taken a picture of these mountains at a quarry in Wales. So what I've tried to do here is go into one of the sort of miners' huts that were in this quarry, and I've tried to give it a bit of a foreground, midground, and background to make it a bit more interesting, a bit different when compared to other people's landscape photos, to give it a bit more interest. So we framed it using a window. We've got this midground of where I am, and we've got the background, which is the ultimate landscape we're going to be looking at. By doing that, it gives it depth, it gives it spatial context, and it gives it, like I say, it gives it a bit more interest compared to what everyone else is taking. Because when it comes to, if you want to enter a competition like the one we've got coming up, or if you want to show off your photo, you're going to want to be a bit different to what everyone else is doing. This helps you achieve that. So next, we're going to explore the art of photography editing, and then we're going to go into doing a live demo of me editing a photo, which hopefully you can choose a photo with while I'm moving over to the iPad, and then we'll go through it together. But first, I'm going to show you just how much of an impact it can have. This is a bit of an impact, but you might find it has an extreme impact on your own. So I'm just going to show you this video here. So I'm going to pause it before it starts. This is the photo I took. So this is the one that's come straight out. Nothing's been done to it. The shadows are quite dark. The sky's a bit bland. It's a nice photo, but I think we can make it better. And so as you can see to the right here, these are all the adjustments that are going to be made to it. These are the adjustments that I ultimately made to this photo. So I brought the highlights right down. I brought the shadows right up. I put some higher white to it, so the whites become more white. I brought the blacks down. The blacks become more black. I've warmed the color balance up. I've made it a bit more vibrant, a bit more saturated. I've sharpened it a little bit, and I've removed some noise, which will be probably fairly important for people taking photos on their phone. Because the camera sensor is so small, it's going to be quite noisy, it's going to be quite grainy. Using noise reduction can just smooth that out a bit if your phone hasn't done it for you already. So I'm just going to play this video to show you these being made in real time, and you'll get to see the sort of impact an edit can have on your photo. Cool. So that's the sort of final image. It's quite dramatic, which is what I was aiming for, because we've placed the sun behind the clouds. We've got a bunch of sun rays. We want it to be a bit punchy. And so we've turned it from this, which is a bit flat, a bit bland in comparison, into a bit of a punchy, dramatic, quite cinematic look, I suppose, is what I was aiming for with this one. Cool. So we're just going to go through understanding what I did there, why I did it, and then we'll jump into the live demo, and we'll get everyone, hopefully, editing some photos, answering any questions while you're editing, and then we can go from there. So what the aim is really is to enhance what you want people to look at. So you might want to reduce the shadows if the thing you're looking at is quite bright in comparison and you don't really care about what's in the shadows. If you reduce those down, they'll go quite dark. Your eyes won't bother to look at them. They'll look at the thing you want people to actually look at. The sharpness, so if you've used a phone and you've got a bit of a shaky hand, if you bring the sharpness up, it should help counter that a little bit. So the idea is more enhancing the detail that's in the photo, sort of creating the vision you want. You're making art. You're not trying to capture the scene perfectly, especially if you're using a phone. It's going to do a bunch of stuff to the photo before it's actually shown it to you anyway. So it's never going to really be what you're seeing. I mean, I've got color blindness, so when I'm making an image, it never looks like what it actually was anyway. So it's all about just trying to bring what you want to show people versus what was actually there. Ignore what was actually there, turn it into a piece of art as if you're making a painting. So I'm going to back out of this now and hope this works. I did test it yesterday and it worked. I'm going to swap over to my iPad and hope for the best that it works. And then I'll share my screen in Apple Photos to go through editing a photo I've taken. So while I'm doing this, if you want to grab a photo on your phone or iPad, whatever you're using, we'll go through editing together. We'll just go through what sort of options are, what they're going to do, and how I go about it anyway. So I shall be right back.
Is everyone okay to get a photograph on their phones?
Mm-hmm. Yes, but when I click edit, it says to edit image, close all open editors. What does that mean?
Do you have anything open in the background? Have you started editing other photos?
I think I do. I've been through everything and I can't find anything open, but I can't work out how to get rid of it.
If you close all the open windows on your phone.
Right. So I'll turn everything off.
Yeah, all the.
And try again.
Would you be able to allow my iPad in your design?
Sure.
I think I'm just
sorry.
sat in the waiting room.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just noticed, sorry.
Right, so got two going on now. Hopefully this works. I'm unmuted on that, not on this. Okay. I'm going to share my screen now.
I'm all right now.
Is it working now, Gwen?
Yes, I forgot the golden rule. Turn it off and turn it on again.
Supposedly. I'm still showing. I am. I'll allow myself to screen share. Hopefully everyone can see my iPad now. If not, I'll disable it and start again.
What's your name?
It's just come through as Zoom user, unfortunately. Aha, I can see my own now, so hopefully you can too. And to jump into Apple Photos here. And we're going to edit this flower here. Okay, I'll move this out the way. Brilliant. I don't know why it wants to not mute this. Oh, there we go. Or not. So this is the photo I'm going to be editing. My sort of focus point is the stamen here. So we're going to change it quite a lot because I want all of this sort of blur around the background to be gone. I don't really care about that. I want to focus your eye in the middle here. I've also wasn't able to get further right with my camera, so we're going to crop it as well so we can line it up better in the rule of thirds. And then we're going to start really editing it. So if on your phone you go to edit or your iPad or wherever, it should open up this sort of view for you. It should be similar, as I mentioned, for Google Photos, but the settings will be the same, so you should be able to follow along. So we're going to go to crop for me, but for yourselves, you can follow along doing this as well if you want, unless you've taken it properly in the first place, unlike me, in which case you won't have to. When you click the edge, you can start to drag that around, which is going to bring the rule of thirds up. Because I really only care about the stamen and the middle part of this flower, I'm going to try and place it in the middle. So this is a bit different to what I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk, in the last talk, because I've said you should put it on the lines or where the lines intersect. But if you put it in the middle, that's all people are going to look at, which is why it's usually something you shouldn't do. You might do it in a portrait, or in this case, for this flower, I really only want you to look in the middle. So I'm going to put it in the middle. Brilliant. I'm going to go back to adjust, so we can then start to adjust things. So Apple and Google usually give you an auto option. So if you want to tap that, that will show you what they think your photo should look like. I disagree, so I'm not going to be using that. So I'm going to click the undo button, and we're going to go manually
Where would
through.
auto be on Google, on an Samsung, Android?
Let me just open my Samsung phone. Give me 2 seconds and I will tell you. Right. Photos. Gallery, it's called on Samsung. If I go to edit, adjust. So for mine, there's a little button after I click the sort of dial in the middle, which says auto on the left. I don't know if that'll be the same for yourself though. I think Yildizan has a Samsung, so she might.
Yeah,
Right.
I think
Yes.
under, I can
I've got
see it
there.
under, okay, under crop,
Perfect.
and then, yeah.
Cool. So we're going to jump back onto this one. I'm not going to use auto, so we're going to start with exposure. And one thing I recommend, no matter what tool you're using, is usually they're going to give you sliders or circles. I recommend going all the way up and down on them, like between the two, and just see what happens to your photo. For each of these settings, this is what we're going to do to really see the extremes of it, so we can then pare it back a bit and use a more subtle version. So I want, I think, it to be a bit brighter, but I don't want it to be as bright as that. So I'm going to just brighten it a little bit, and then we're going to, oh, this happens when I use the pen. Going to move down to brilliance. This might not exist on Samsung or Google Photos, so you may not be able to follow along exactly, but again, just move setting by setting and play with the slider and see what it does. So for me, brilliance wise, I'm going to see what that does. It seems to balance out the photo a little bit. So dim the highlights, raise the shadows, make the colors pop a little bit. Same, so if I go all the way up, it goes very bright. If I go all the way down, it goes very dark. I'm going to raise it just a little bit. So for me, it's going to be 10. You may want to go further or less. That's entirely up to you. So for highlights, it's as it says, really. It's going to adjust the highlights down or up. So again, with all the sliders, we're going to go all the way up. We're going to see, what does that do? Okay, that's a bit far. Same for all the way down. That's made it extremely dark, quite saturated in color, but not very bright. So I do want to be going in that direction, but not as far. So I'm going to bring it down to about 35, I'd say. And I'm going to move on to shadows, do the exact same thing again. We're going to go all the way up. Okay, that's way too bright. I don't like that. I'm going to go all the way down. Cool, it's very dark, but this is the direction I want to go in. So I'm going to pare it back a little bit to around about 50, actually, because as I mentioned, I want you to look in the middle of this photo. I want you to see the softness of the petals, but I don't really care about anything outside of that. So I'm going to drop all the shadows that are going on around the flower to try and draw your eyes inward towards the bright center. Contrast is going to be the sort of varying level between your highlights and your shadows. So you can introduce contrast yourself by playing with those highlights and shadows. If you bring the highlight up and the shadow down, you're going to bring contrast to the image, which is what I've just done. Or you can just use the contrast slider to do it for you. Oh, again, using the Apple Pen does this one. If I go all the way up, as I said, with 100% contrast, I've put the shadows into oblivion and I've brought the highlights into a crazy level, so there's a huge difference. Same with the opposite. At this point, the highlights and the shadows are exactly the same. The image becomes completely flat, completely boring. You usually want a bit of contrast in your photo rather than less. So I'm going to add about 5, just because I've already added some contrast by bringing the highlights down and the shadows up a bit. Next is brightness for me. It might be a bit different for you, but again, we'll just go step through each setting doing this. All the way up, all the way down. I want to move it into a less bright setting, I think. So I'm going to bring that down just a smidge, because as you can see, the lines on the petals become a bit more visible when I bring the brightness down. So I'm going to just bring that down a smidge, and then move on. So next we've got black point. This might just be called blacks in your photo editing tool, whether that be Samsung, Google, or Apple, in this point being black point. This is going to make your blacks more black or less black. So if we were to slide it all the way up, that has now made everything that's got a bit of black in it extremely black. And vice versa, if we go all the way down, it's going to make anything that's got a little bit of black in it extremely grey, because it's trying to pull out that black essentially. I want it to be quite dramatic, so I'm actually going to want the blacks to be a bit more black, if anything. So I'm going to add a bit more black into the blacks. Next is saturation. It's sort of as you'd expect. Every color is going to become
Anyone else not got black on the Android?
I will jump into that myself. 2 seconds, I'll be able to see what the equivalent might be.
On my Samsung, there are black points and white point option. Gwen?
Whereabouts did you find them? In the
under adjust.
Pardon?
If you go to adjust, under edit, adjust, and then the black and white point.
Interestingly, I don't on my Samsung either, actually.
Oh,
Can't find it online.
So they might have taken it out for some reason. I don't know why they would do that,
yeah.
but you can achieve similar-ish things by... Pardon?
I'd like to get rid of the background.
So in the Samsung, there's usually a tool, but I can't remember exactly where it is, to enable you to do that. Is the background quite bright or quite dark in your photo to start with?
Right.
So I would try to bring the highlights down a bit potentially. It might also impact your subject, but if you bring the highlights down, it should dim that as well. And also, if you can crop in a little bit, that might, cut out a bit of that background as well.
Better.
Brilliant. So for my saturation here, I drag all the way up, the colors go a bit insane. I drag it down, it becomes grayscale. So I do like colors, regardless of whether or not I can see them properly. So I'm going to add a little bit of extra color into it, a bit more than the phone thought was actually there. Again, as I mentioned in the talk, you're not here to make a perfect representation of what you saw. You're making a painting based on what was there. So you're going to play with it as much as you want. If you want extreme colors, go for it. It's for you at the end of the day. So vibrancy is similar to saturation, but it's going to increase the brightness of the color rather than the amount of that color. So if I drag it all the way up, the yellow, if you look from the center of that flower, in real life was touching the white part of the petals, but you couldn't really see it that much because it was quite dim. But by bringing the vibrancy up, you can start to see how that yellow light was touching those petals. I'm not going to go to that extent because that's a bit much, but you can see vice versa. If you remove the sort of light content of those colors, it draws it all away as well. So I'm going to add a bit because I quite like that the yellow of the center of this flower was impacting the rest of the petals. So I'm going to add a little bit more. Next, for any Apple users, is going to be warmth. I think that's on Samsung as well. So this is going to adjust the white balance. The more warm it is, the more orange, red tones are going to be introduced, and vice versa. The less warm it is, it's going to become more blue, more cold. This is similar to
temperature.
artificially. Yeah, it's exactly, temperature's exactly it, yes.
Oh, yes.
It's similar to artificially introducing that golden hour. So if you remember, I said you want to get out in the hour before sunset and the hour after sunrise. This slider is going to let you simulate that a little bit. In real life, it's going to be better. So if you did it at those times, it's going to look better. But you can add a bit of that warmth in if you got out at 4 p.m. rather than say 7, 8 p.m. So I'm going to add a little bit of warmth. So as I say, drag the slider all the way up and down to see the extremes of it. All the way at 100, everything's gone a bit pink because it introduced a bunch of red and orange. All the way down, it's gone quite blue because it's tried to introduce those blue tones. I'm going to make it a little bit warmer. So for me, it's going to be around 15. Tint is a weird one. I think it's red and green is what this is doing. This one is really difficult for me to see and therefore explain. So I'm red-green colorblind, so not much changes in the photo when I change these settings. So I'm just going to leave that one alone. But if you can see the differences in the photo when you slide that about, go for where you feel looks best for you. Don't go for natural if you don't want to. If you're trying to make a bit of a psychedelic piece of art, go wild. So sharpness is something I mentioned in the talk as well. Phones tend to have a bit of a slower shutter speed because they're so small. Because of that, you might get a bit of a blur in your photo because even like you breathing can move your hands just a little bit. So if you introduce a bit of sharpness, it will try and counter that bit of blurriness that's going on in your photo. So I'm going to add 100 to show the extreme of it. So I was already quite sharp to start with, so there was not a huge amount of difference. But from 0, if you were to look at the lines in the petals, they're quite soft. So if I use this, so if you look in this section of the petal there, the lines are there, but they're quite soft. If we drag this to be extremely sharp, you can see these lines have become more defined. This will happen on the edges of your petals. It will happen on the outside edges of the stamen, the leaves. That's a bit extreme for me, so I'm going to pull that back pretty much to 0. But I do want a little bit, so I'm going to add maybe 10, because I want a tiny bit of definition in the leaf so it's not flat. Definition is extremely similar, but it's going to sort of alter the difference between shadow and light to bring a bit of depth to your image, make it more poppy, you might say, a bit more 3D. I quite like the flatter look to mine, so I'm going to leave it entirely at 0 and move on. Noise reduction. So this was something I mentioned as well. The size of your sensor is quite important in what ISO it uses. And the ISO it uses, the lower you are, the less sort of grains there are in your picture, the less crunchy you might call it. The higher it is, the more grains will exist. I had quite a low ISO in this, so I don't really need to use it. But if you're finding that you can see little dots all over your photo, you can use noise reduction to sort of smooth it out. If your photo doesn't have much and you were to use this, if I go to 100, it will make your photo look a bit blurry, a bit too smooth, because it's trying to almost put Vaseline over it to smooth out those grains. So I'm not going to do that because I don't need it. Finally, vignette. So you might already know what this is. It's either a lightening or a darkening at the edges of your frame. So if I go all the way down, if you look at the bottom left, top left, and vice versa, the right ones as well, you can see at 0, it's quite dark. But if I apply a lightening vignette, it lightens those corners, almost like adding a circle around the image that is lighter. And for darker, I can bring all of that extra darkness in around the edges. So when you were saying about
what
the
that might be on
background,
Android.
Let's have a look. Hopefully it has it.
On my Samsung, it is the last option under edit and adjust.
Definition.
No, so I've got definition as well. It doesn't seem to have it on the latest Samsung. It's like they've taken away options, which is quite annoying. Do you have Google Photos at all, Gwen?
Sorry.
Do you have Google Photos, the app?
Not that I know of.
It might be worth potentially, I don't know if you want to do it now or afterwards, downloading that app, because I think that provides the option. So you'll see all your photos in there as well. And I think if I go into edit on that app,
I'll try that afterwards.
Yeah, because that has the black points, the white points, and the vignette settings as well. So that'll give you more options to edit your photo.
Thank you.
All this will apply the same way. It all looks the same, just with a few more options. When you were saying that you had things in the background, you sort of wanted to fade away, a vignette can help with that. So
that's just what I was thinking.
I'm going to add quite a bit of a vignette because I do not care for the leaves that are around the edge of the frame. I want them to sort of disappear. So that is all of the options gone through for this on mine. There's also this option of filters. This can give you different sort of black and white, sort of silver tone, whatever they mean by that, sort of flat monotone, dramatic cool. I don't know what they mean by any of these phrases. Apple may know, I don't. Dramatic warm, just dramatic in general. You can do a varying amount of that setting. Same with everything else. It's worth having a look through these potentially as a starting point for your editing. I don't tend to use them because I like having sort of control. I don't really want Apple to choose for me. But if you want a black and white, this is a good place to go because they do usually have some nice black and white settings. I don't, so I'm going to ignore that. So this is my final edited image. If you tap it, you get to see for a brief moment your original. So this is obviously showing the difference between my original to my edited one. You can see it's quite a dramatic difference. I've really brought your eye into the middle. I've taken away all the outside of the image. I don't really care about it. I've added some punch using the sort of vibrancy, a bit of sharpness, and that's my final image. So that's pretty much it. I've gone on for a while. Apologies. I was trying to aim for 40 minutes. I am not very good, but I'm hoping that can help you sort of take your image to the next level because it's hard enough to take a good image to start with, but you're competing against people that might spend hours in this editing. So if you even just use a bit of editing yourself, it can really take it a few notches up. I don't think I've ever not edited an image. I'm just trying to think within around the 15,000 I've taken, I think I've edited every single one of them. If you look in any sort of photography competition, sort of world photographers, nature photography, they're going to spend hours in their editing tools, touching up shadows. They'll be going, not like me where I'm just sliding up and down like a madman. They'll do a like 0.1, 0.2 difference to really hone in on the sort of vision they had for the photo. If you're seeing a photo on billboards or in magazines or on websites, on Instagram, it is never the one that came out of their camera. They have always done a bunch of editing to it. So I do recommend going through all of these settings when you've taken a nice photo to really elevate it. That is pretty much it for me. So if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So if there's any of those settings that you didn't quite get, or if you want any other sort of things answered, I'm more than happy to. Otherwise, that's about it. I'll hand back over to your design.
Thank you, Mark.
Remind me what you do, how it is you take multiple photographs, please.
So the burst mode.
Sorry?
Is that burst mode? So where you hold the shutter button down while you're taking a photo, and whilst you're holding it down, it should take an awful lot of photos. So the longer you hold it down, the more photos it's going to take. I believe with Samsung, I'll give it a try now. I've just got my Samsung, so I'm learning along with you here. Oh, no.
No, it didn't.
Okay, so for Samsung, if you hold the shutter button and then drag it downwards and hold it, so the longer you hold it down, so you sort of slide your finger down after pressing in the shutter button, it should start taking photos and you'll see the number increasing. Oh, I've just taken 60 while saying that.
No,
Interesting.
it goes red.
So that might be because you're just pressing it down. So when you press it, it's hard to explain in terms of spatial. If you press it inwards and then drag it down towards the bottom of your screen.
Oh, yeah, it's
There
going
you
like
go.
mad now.
Perfect.
Taken
Yeah,
me
it's hard to
34
talk in terms of
pictures.
space on a flat image. So yeah, that should then hopefully give you the option when you go into your gallery to click on that sort of section of photos. Yeah, and then when you go into your gallery at the bottom left, it will show sort of frames with a number next to it. If you tap that, you can then swipe through and pick the one you like.
Mm.
Just taking an awful lot of my keyboard there.
Right.
Brilliant.